Welcome to the American Experience. I'm David McCullough. On an afternoon in May 1889, one of the worst disasters in the nation's history took place in a small industrial city in western Pennsylvania, a city that few Americans had ever heard of. In a matter of days, the whole world knew about Johnstown. A dam had failed in the mountains above the city, and down came a wall of water that was anywhere from 20 to 40 to 60 feet high, or higher, depending on the width of the valley. It destroyed everything in its path. When it hit Johnstown, the city was obliterated. Why did it happen? What or who was to blame? This is our story, the Johnstown flood. I grew up in western Pennsylvania. I'd heard about the Johnstown flood my whole life. As children, we used to shout, "Run for the hills, the dam is busted," little knowing what real terror is in those words. It wasn't until years later, when I was at the Library of Congress one day and saw a set of old photographs of the disaster, that I came to realize what a horrible event it really had been. I wanted to know more. I read one old book, then another. Pretty soon, I found I was writing a book of my own, digging into old records, interviewing survivors, many of whom were still alive then. That was in the 1960s. I'm back in Johnstown now. This is the main exhibition hall of the new Johnstown Flood Museum. Behind me is an abstract representation of the wall of water and debris that struck the city. Our film is an expanded version of a film made especially for the museum and that won an Academy Award. It's the work of the distinguished documentary producer Charles Guggenheim, and part of what you're about to see, the new part, is a rare new view of life as it was lived on the lake in the mountains at the exclusive South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, in old photographs newly discovered by Mr. Guggenheim. And the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club is the key to the story. For this is not the chronicle of a simple calamity of nature, not by any means.
Since the beginning of time, the Little Conemaugh flowed from the forests of the Alleghenies to the valley below, its journey uninterrupted until the coming of man. Here in the 1860s and 70s, in the level floodplain where the Little Conemaugh meets the Stony Creek, the city of Johnstown had thundered to life with the coming together of coal and steel. In the year 1889, the population had reached 30,000, packed so tight there was scarcely room to build more. At the center of things was the Cambria Iron Company. With its Bessemer plant working night and day, Cambria made steel rails, barbed wire, and plowshares. They worked 10 and 12-hour-a-day shifts, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. The valley was full of smoke, and the city glowed 24 hours a day with the fires of progress. Cambria alone employed 7,000 men, and at $1.50 a day, a person was doing well. Compared with other industrial towns, the leaders in Johnstown were progressive, even paternalistic. At the pay window on Saturday, a man wore his best suit, out of respect for the job he had and his pride in the community. As towns went, Johnstown was a good place to plan a future and raise a family. Downtown, there were new electric lights in the streets and 3 new blocks. And most any day of the week, one could see a new show at the Opera House on Main or Washington Street. In 1889, there were already 70 phones in town, 27 churches, 123 saloons, 3 newspapers, a new company hospital, 2 railroad stations, and up-to-date fire and police departments, staffed predominantly by the Irish, who had originally come to build the railroads and stayed on. The Germans had also come in large numbers starting in the 1840s, some fleeing revolutions, others seeking economic opportunity and religious freedom. The vast majority were either Irish, Scotch-Irish, Cornish, German, or Welsh, with the Germans and the Welsh outnumbering all the rest. Together, they had established a thriving mercantile community, filling their stores with the latest goods brought in on the main line from Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia. In the spring of 1889, there was little on the main street of Johnstown that would give rise to speculation there was a life anywhere else. But 14 miles up the valley, there was indeed another life going on. And it was a very different life. It was known by the 61 members from Pittsburgh who were invited to join as the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. But to everyone else, the place was largely a mystery. Its summer homes and outbuildings half hidden beyond the shoreline. Their owners referred to them as cottages, but with few exceptions, they were 3 stories tall with 14 to 15 rooms. Overlooking the boathouses, their deep porches and generous windows commanded a splendid view of the mountain lake. But even the largest of the cottages was dwarfed by the 47-room clubhouse, where during the season most members and their guests stayed, and where everyone was required to take their meals. Here on weekends and during the summer months, they spent time together away from Pittsburgh. Here in the gentle woods, even the very hottest days were comfortable under the big trees. Here, young men and women could stroll and boat with those of their own kind. Here, protected by the privacy of their land, they were free from the intrusions of the outside world, interrupted only by those who worked the grounds and maintained the dam. It was a dam built and abandoned by the state of Pennsylvania over 20 years earlier and subsequently neglected by later owners that now demanded the club's attention. Its previous owners had taken little interest in making it safe. And as for the club's part, they had removed as much as 3 feet from its top in order to make it wide enough for their carriages to pass. Considering the problems at the dam more bothersome than alarming, the club engaged in periodic maintenance, filling leaks and weak points with mud, rocks, brush, and manure. Of most concern was the spillway. It was now only 4 feet lower than the top of the dam, creating the possibility that a heavy rain could overfill the spillway and cause water to crest over the dam's weakest point, the center. But for those who came to get away from the city, the spillway represented a magic place to meet and to picnic. No one found this place more enchanting than the Clark family. Not as well known as the Carnegies and the Fricks, they were nonetheless one of the first families invited to membership in the club. Charles J. Clark, like his contemporaries, was well-to-do, well married, and an important man in Pittsburgh. He was representative of that small group who, during the latter part of the 19th century, helped lead Pittsburgh into unprecedented industrial growth. Clark himself was in the transportation business, riding the wave of prosperity brought about by the ascendance of coal and steel. In the 1880s, Pittsburgh looked very much like Johnstown, 10 times over. Here, too, the workers lived on the side of the hill and could name the men who ran things in the valley. Men like Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had emerged from Pittsburgh's slag town to become one of the richest men in the world and a member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Also, there was club member Henry Clay Frick, the great Coke King, solitary and humorless. He was, at 40, considered the most important man in Pittsburgh. And Henry Phipps, no risk-taker, but a genius with figures who worked alongside Carnegie and Frick and attached his future to theirs. And the quiet, frail-looking Andrew Mellon, who in his 30s was already financing the enterprises of the most important names in Pittsburgh. In the 1880s, a small group of Pittsburgh industrialists were moving goods to every corner of the world. The man in charge of moving things was Robert Pitcairn, a childhood friend of Carnegie's, and like him, a member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Pitcairn was head of the Pittsburgh division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, a company that was on its way to becoming the biggest and the most powerful political force in the state. The railroad did business with nearly everybody and connected the towns in Pennsylvania to the nation with over 75,000 miles of track. Like Pitcairn's railroad, the great industrial fortunes of Pittsburgh were tied together by steel and the products made from it. Companies owned by members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club represented some of the largest corporations in the United States. Fortunes flowing from this success were represented in the homes now going up on Pittsburgh's east side. Pitcairn had built himself a 50-room mansion with room to house a staff of 12. Charles Clark's Victorian estate was named Alicia, with a greenhouse as large as the house itself. Henry Clay Frick's residence was predictably called Clayton. Lawyer Philander Knox's home, though less ostentatious, was strategically located next to his client's. Artisans and materials were imported from Europe to create Italianate-like interiors, or a mixture of everything. Social gatherings flowed effortlessly from mansion to mansion. And families living here had a propensity for marrying one another. It wasn't until the latter part of the century that they were inclined to explore the possibility that life in other places might be as interesting as their own. Most vacations away from Pittsburgh were brief, and the places visited predictable. But few summers went by without putting time aside for the mountains near Pittsburgh. Even Andrew Carnegie, who now owned a house in New York and a castle in Scotland. Out of Pittsburgh they came, leaving behind a world they had the luxury to escape. It was an attractive idea for lawyer and club member Philander Knox and other of the best people in Pittsburgh to buy a piece of tranquility in the quiet mountains away from the city dirt and smoke. It probably escaped him, as it did others, that he and his clients had bought shares in a lake and a dam in which problems lay below the surface. The dam had already failed once, and a previous owner had sold the discharge pipes for scrap. It was now impossible to relieve the pressure on the dam or to drain the lake for repairs. Knowingly or unknowingly, what the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had purchased was a neglected dam in which those in charge were not willing to invest money for repairs. Traveling to South Fork demanded less than a 2-hour train ride from Pittsburgh. For members, a weekend there was not out of the question. South Fork looked like a dozen other small towns along the main line. But it was the nearest point of any size to the club at Lake Conemaugh. While engines took on water and coal, members of the club left the train and were met by carriages for a 2.5-mile trip up the mountain road. Carriages heading for the club took the road to the right, onto the breast of the dam itself. It was a trip that some members took with more than passing interest. Robert Pitcairn, for instance, on one visit asked Benjamin Ruff, the president of the club who had purchased the dam and sold shares in it, to join him to discuss. In the spring of 1889, the club's summer season was about to begin. Some boats were already in the water. In front of the clubhouse, 25 bathhouses stood newly painted. Early arrivals gathered to watch the annual launching of the fleet. Waiters and domestics recruited from the valley stood ready to greet the guests. As the children of the club's employees looked on, the young men and women up from Pittsburgh filled their days in ways the locals found endlessly fascinating.
Phillips, Harden, and Long, well, on the right side. Horn.
Each morning, there were planned activities, frequently under the direction of paid instructors, preparing the young men from Pittsburgh to compete with the very best in Eastern schools. On a bright, breezy day, 50 sails could be seen on the water. No one took advantage or more delight in the club than the Clark family. Their son, Lewis, had invented in Pittsburgh and introduced at the lake a battery-powered catamaran of his own design. It was complete with searchlight and sailor suit. In the afternoon, the Clarks would tour the lake in one of the club's steamboats. Young Lewis Clark, besides being an accomplished inventor, was a gifted amateur photographer who, with a camera of his own design, recorded the only extant pictures of life on the lake. In the evening, the Clarks would stroll down the boardwalk to the clubhouse and join other families for dinner, and gather later on the side steps with the Henry Phippses for a concert by the local German band. It was a perfect setting for sons and daughters of the best families of Pittsburgh to get to know one another. In the evening, young Lewis Clark would take his camera to the lake and impress the young ladies with his sense of composition and light. No summer at South Fork was complete without moments in costume. The remoteness had a way of exciting fantasies. a fondness of depicting lives in simpler times. Brought in trunks from Pittsburgh, costumes were used to create living tableaus depicting classics in poetry and prose. But exploring the far reaches of the lake remained the favorite pastime. With journeys usually ending at the lake's most northern shore, where the water touched the great earthen dam, 500 feet and 14 miles above the town below. People living in Johnstown knew very little about what kind of life was going on up on the mountain. A few had ventured up and near the lake to hunt and fish, and had been turned away. Others had brought back stories about seeing sailboats on the mountain, and that seemed very strange. But there was one man in Johnstown who considered the dam and lake far more than a mystery. As head of the Cambria Iron Works, Daniel J. Morrell was by far the most important man in town. He had successfully placed Johnstown in the forefront of steelmaking, even before Pittsburgh had a mill. But in recent years, Carnegie and others had stolen his best men, and Morrell was not inclined to remain passive about the dam or what the club was up to on the mountain. In the fall of 1880, he wrote a letter to club president B.F. Ruff, requesting that he be allowed to send his people to the dam to make a critical inspection. John Fulton was Morrell's chief engineer, a geologist, and a deeply religious man. Fulton arrived at the dam to have a meeting with Ruff and to see for himself. Fulton took every opportunity to question Ruff regarding the dam's safety. Fulton confirmed that the damage to the dam's base created by the removal of the discharge pipes had never been dealt with. He pointed out that the leaks Ruff discounted as being the product of spring water were in fact coming from the lake itself. He also saw evidence that high water had begun to make a cut on the dam's west side. Ruff avoided telling Fulton that the club had lowered the dam and had compromised the spillway by installing fish screens at the mouth to keep the game fish from escaping. Fulton left that day convinced the dam was an accident ready to happen. Morrell read Fulton's assessment and passed it directly on to Ruff at South Fork, proposing to share the cost of repairs. Ruff replied on December 2nd. We consider Fulton's conclusion as to our only safe course no more value than his assertion. You and your people are in no danger from our enterprise. It started on May 28th somewhere over Kansas and Nebraska. And within 24 hours, it had reached the already rain-soaked slopes of the Alleghenies. In fields around Johnstown, the earth could not absorb more water. At Lake Conemaugh, 8 inches had fallen. Streams were forming that had never been seen before. Rivers were rising at better than a foot an hour. In Johnstown, there was water in the streets, and though this was not new, this time things were more ominous. That morning, George T. Swank, the editor and proprietor of the Johnstown Tribune, worked on his journal. He had seen Johnstown underwater before, but nothing like this. From his second-story office window, he had observed people being rescued in boats and livestock being swept down the street by a current, which had turned the streets into rivers. Two eastbound trains, the Chicago Limited and the freight from Derry, got as far as South Fork, where they were being held. Word came down that there was trouble at Lily. Bear Run had risen more than 6 feet and washed out a quarter-mile of track. The Day Express, with 90 passengers plus crew, was being held at East Conemaugh for further orders. Nothing now could move either east or west. With lines down, trackmen were out searching for the trouble. When Club Superintendent Elias Unger awoke that morning, he saw that the lake had risen almost 2 feet overnight and was rising an inch every 10 minutes. Unger had special reasons to be concerned. He had recently been named the club's general manager and had taken part in the inspection visits of both Pitcairn and Fulton. Now he could see that the spillway could not handle more water, a problem made worse by the debris that was accumulating around the club's fish screens. Unger saw other problems. Old wounds were reopening. At 11:30, John Park, the dam's engineer, left in hopes of getting a warning message to Johnstown. In the meantime, Unger had gathered a crew. He was attempting to free the spillway and to raise the top of the dam. John Park reached South Fork, and his warning was delivered to telegraph operator Emma Ehrenfeld. With lines down, she could only send it 4 miles down the line to W.H. Pickerel at Mineral Point. It warned that the water is running over the breast of the dam in center and west side and is becoming dangerous. At Mineral Point, Pickerel had found a passing trackman to deliver the message to the AO Tower, 1.5 miles down the track. The message had reached the AO Tower to be forwarded to East Conemaugh and Agent Frank Deckard in Johnstown. Deckard's message now went down to Robert Pitcairn, addressed to his office in Pittsburgh. Within minutes, Pitcairn ordered his private car attached to the Pennsylvania's eastbound passenger train, number 18. Heading towards Johnstown, Pitcairn saw along the right-of-way evidence confirming his worst fears. At 3 p.m., the Western Union wires in Johnstown went dead. The time was 3:10 p.m., May 31st, 1889. Located on a hillside, South Fork escaped annihilation. A mile away lay the railroad viaduct. It held like a dam, but for a few moments. Engineer John Hess, escaping the water before him, ran backward using his whistle to warn the people of East Conemaugh. The stone bridge held. But the worst was yet to come. Within a period of 10 minutes, the center of the city had been swept away. 2,200 men, women, and children were dead. "34 engines, weighing up to 80 tons, had been strewn over the landscape, some for almost a mile. Section 1 of the Day Express had been ripped apart. Most who had remained on board had drowned. In the second section, the only fatalities were those that had made a run for it. Some things stood. The ironworks was still there. Then slowly, the living emerged from the ruins. those who had been spared, there was the paralyzing fear of not knowing what part of their life remained in the valley. At the stone bridge, it had been a night of indescribable horrors. Oil tanks had ruptured and caught fire. The smell of burning flesh hung among the wreckage. 500 people had been driven into the bridge and the burning heap. Thousands buried in the mud. 1 out of every 3 bodies found would never be identified. A schoolhouse, a Catholic and Presbyterian church, and a saloon had become morgues. The living came together. Men asking of wives, women asking of husbands, children seeking mothers and fathers. "99 whole families had been wiped out. 124 women were left widows. 98 children had lost both parents. 198 men lost their wives. 1 woman lost her husband and 7 children. 1 man, his wife, father, and 8 children. Now some were leaving, their homes and families broken. But most were determined to stay. Within hours, they had called meetings, selected leaders, organized work crews, deputized a police force, and established a hospital. They had set out to rebuild their town. A witness to the devastation, Pitcairn had ordered the railroad to send thousands of men and tons of machinery to Johnstown. Working 7 days and nights, his crews replaced the great stone viaduct that had disappeared only a few days earlier. From every part of the country, hundreds of volunteers arrived, and with the militia and state agencies set to work to prevent epidemics and relieve the suffering. A nation paralyzed by the news sent thousands of messages offering help. Thousands more sought the whereabouts of the living and the dead. One of the most impressive rescue efforts to come to Johnstown was headed by a woman. Arriving 5 days after the flood, Clara Barton, competitive, persistent, never left Johnstown for 5 months. Within weeks, the Red Cross and other agencies had built hotels, housing, and distribution centers. In addition to over $3 million in cash, People donated mattresses, hair combs, pillows, tables, chairs, tents, cook stoves, and over 7,000 pairs of shoes. But most remarkable was the people themselves. Within days, they had reported for work, fired the furnaces, and set the lathes going again. For days and weeks, they would live in the mud. But no one now questioned that out of this would rise a new city. The only question was how long it would take, and always, why did it happen? They were gone, and they would not return. They had left for the living only memories of a life once lived on the mountain, of a life once lived in the valley.
The lesson of the Johnstown flood is this: it's a great mistake, possibly even perilous, ever to assume that because people are in positions of responsibility, they are therefore behaving responsibly. Only Daniel J. Morrell of Cambria Iron had raised questions about the safety of the dam. But by 1889, Morrell was dead. His warnings were heard no more. The tragedy of the Johnstown flood is that it need never have happened. I'm David McCullough. Good night.
Major funding for this series is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.